All right, so today we have Professor Agawu-Kakraba here to talk about historical fiction within the context of Afro-Brazilian transatlantic reverse migration, the case of the Restless Crucible. So Agawu-Kakraba is a professor of Spanish and African Studies at Pennsylvania State University. He holds a PhD in Hispanic languages, literatures, and cultures from Cornell University and an MA in Spanish from the University of Alberta, and a BA in Spanish and Linguistics from the University of Ghana. His research focuses on 20th and 21st century contemporary Spanish fiction and Afro-Hispanic and Lusophone literatures and cultures. He is the author of Postmodernity in Spanish Fiction and Culture, Demythification in the Fiction of Miguel Delibes with Peter Lang, and co-editor of Diasporic Identities within Afro-Hispanic and African Contexts, an African Lusophone and Afro-Hispanic Cultural Dialogue. His debut novel, The Restless Crucible, published in 2022, has been nominated for the 2024 African Literature Association Book of the Year Award in Creative Writing. So we are so honored to have you here, Professor Ya. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, for that nice introduction. I'd like, first of all, to thank Professor Marconi for having the foresight to initiate this forum that over years has seen some outstanding presentations from scholars from all over the world. So before I begin, I'd just like to recognize a few people in attendance here, mostly my colleagues from Penn State, and also some colleagues from the Ghanaian Hispanists Association. I also want to recognize Professor Dixon Abreu, who is here with us, and Dr. Abreu is currently translating The Restless Crucible into Portuguese. So it's nice to have him here with us. So I'll be breaking my presentation into 4 parts. First, I will explore what reverse migration is and some of the definitions that have been proffered within. And within this space, I'll identify Afro-Brazilian ex-slave returnee communities in West Africa. Second, I'll look at some of the factors that precipitated Afro-Brazilian transatlantic reverse migration. And then third, I'll highlight the importance of historical fiction within the framework of Afro-Brazilian transatlantic reverse migration. Then I will discuss why I chose historical fiction as a genre for The Restless Crucible. And then finally, I'll read excerpts from the novel that I hope will circle back to the first 3 observations. So I think we can begin now by having me get onto the PowerPoint. All right, so the title for the presentation, as you can see, is Historical Fiction within the context of Afro-Brazilian transatlantic reverse migration, the case of the Restless Crucible. So what is reverse migration? There have been some different kinds of definitions that have been proffered. So one of them is when people return after emigration for the first time to their country of or region of origin, then and only then can we use the term return migration. And then another definition, return migration is defined as the movement of immigrants back to their homeland to resettle. Yet another definition, return migration is when people return to their country or region of origin after a significant period abroad or in another region. A fourth one, the return of migrants to their country of origin, sometimes as a fulfillment of original intentions, sometimes as a consequence of revised intentions. And then return migration, referring to the movement of migrants back to a country of origin following an absence of at least 1 year. So what we notice with all these definitions is that there are several points of contentions with regard to the length of migration. Some say after emigrating for the first time, a significant period abroad, following an absence of at least 1 year, and again, the place of return, their country or region of origin, homeland, their country of origin, a country of origin. So there are all these different, points of contention. For my purposes, though, I will define the Afro-Brazilian transatlantic reverse migration as a return migration, as the act of freed or ex-slaves voluntarily returning to the African continent, being forcibly taken to Brazil. So that is my working definition for this. So what are some of the ex-slave returnee communities in West Africa? The first one are the Saro in Nigeria. So during the period of 1837 and 1944, liberated Africans with their children, mostly from the Nigeria area, who were resettled in Sierra Leone, returned to Nigeria. So they were originally from the United States, went to Liberia, and then consequently returned to Nigeria. So they and their descendants in Nigeria are known as the Saro. So most of them were of Yoruba origin. Their population included Igbo, Nupe, Bassa, Hausa, and Efik. So most of them returned to Lagos, Abeokuta, Ibadan, Calabar. So these were locations of political, economic, or missionary significance. These were of importance to them, so they migrated to these particular spaces. And then the second group is the Aguda in Benin, in Togo, as well as in Nigeria. So beginning from the 1830s, many of the emancipated Africans who had gone through forced labor and discrimination in Brazil began moving back to Lagos. And as they did this, they brought along with them some cultural and social sensibilities they adapted from their sojourn in Brazil. So these emancipated, people were called the Aguda or Amaro in either Benin or Togo. Then we have the Tabon in Ghana. The Tabon people are also Afro-Brazilian community of former enslaved peoples who returned to Africa, in this case, Ghana. So when they arrived in Jamestown, Accra, they could speak only Portuguese and would conspicuously use the phrase Tabon, which means okay. So the Ga people who primarily inhabited the Jamestown neighborhood in Accra started to call them Tabon. So that name has stuck. And the Tabon actually came to Ghana on a ship called SS Salisbury that was offered to them by the British government. So these are the three main ex-slave returnee communities that you find in West Africa. So let's look at some of the factors that precipitated the Afro-Brazilian transatlantic reverse migration. So the first is manumission, which is the act of granting a slave his or her freedom. Now, it's important to note that Portuguese and Spanish laws governing slavery descended from the same Roman precedents. So slaves theoretically could appeal to royal justice to bring complaints against their owners. But of course, the laws were largely unenforced. With regard to manumission, however, there was a difference between Spain and Portugal. So whereas in Spanish America, the Spanish law guaranteed a slave's right to buy his or her own freedom, Portuguese and Brazilian law recognized no such right. So negotiations only took place between masters and the slaves. That was the only way in which they could essentially be allowed to work with manumission. Then the second factor that also brought this about was the Malay uprising in Salvador in 1835. So the uprising occurred during the last 10 days of Ramadan in January 1835, when enslaved African Muslims and freemen rose against the government. So most of them were Yoruba and Hausa, and they referred to these people as Muslim. The Muslims, the word for Muslim was Malay. So they essentially couched that uprising as the Malay uprising. But it wasn't only Muslims who took part in this uprising. There were non-Muslims from various backgrounds that also participated. So after the rebellion, the Brazilian government was fearful of further insurrection. So they allowed some of the freed or manumitted Africans the option to return home or to keep paying an exorbitant tax to the government. So a few Africans who were free and had saved money were able to return to Africa as a result of the tough conditions, taxation, racism, and homesickness. So, for instance, in 1854, 60 Mina Africans, Mina is a place in Benin and formerly Dahomey. So about 60 of them were able to put together $4,000 to charter a ship to take them to Badagry and eventually to Mina. Then the third factor was the Ley Aurea, which is the golden law that ended slavery in 1888. Now, it must be pointed out that even though slavery ended this year, there were so many ex-slaves that lived in rural poverty. Most of them were denied education and wages under slavery. So freedom didn't really mean much for them, because some of these ex-slaves were forced out of necessity to continue renting land from their former slave owners. So these are the three main factors that sort of propelled this reverse migration. Then let's take a look at the importance of historical fiction within the framework of this reverse migration. Now, I know that most of you here know what historical fiction is, but for purposes of just touching base again, let's just give a brief description of what historical fiction is. So it's a genre of literature comprising narratives that take place in the past and are characterized by an imaginative reconstruction of historical events and personages. So that would be the broad definition of historical fiction. Different types of historical fiction, but I've sort of narrowed them down to a few for my own purposes here. So the first one will be biographical historical fiction that includes people who actually existed. And this is important for my novel because the main character is modeled against, along the lines of a fictional, a real person who lived. And then we have historical adventures, mysteries, conflicts steered by the specifics of the historical setting. And then we have alternate history. What would have happened if X or Y didn't occur? So, these are some of the types of historical fiction. But what do they do? What do historical fictions do? So they provide readers or viewers a chance to see history from a different perspective, to capture the details of the time period as accurately as possible, providing authenticity, including social norms, manners, customs, and traditions. So in this case, it may involve more exposition or exploration of where the story is set than in other genres. So what is the role of the historical fiction novelist? What does the novelist do? So typically exposes the reader to the inner workings of people across time and place. And so in order to illuminate the histories and told stories, allowing people to understand the experience on a more complex level and the truth about those experiences. So having said this, why did I choose historical fiction for the Restless Crucible? First of all, to illuminate histories and told stories as we see here, especially about African-based abolitionism, to see the history from a different perspective and also as a contestation to representation. And I'll dwell on the third part because I think that is quite important. And in order to do that, I look at the case of Bruce Chatwin's The Viceroy of Ouida. And Bruce Chatwin was a British travel writer, and he wrote this novel in 1980. And in this novel, Chatwin tells of Francisco Manuel da Silva, a poor Brazilian adventurer who sails to Dahomey in West Africa to trade for slaves and amass his fortune. So his plans really exceed his dreams, and soon he becomes the viceroy of Ouida, master of all trading in Dahomey. But he does this by overthrowing the king. He colludes with the king's son, and through that, he succeeds in overthrowing the king. But before that, he and the king had worked together. He had trained a lot of the fighters, and if most of you recall Viola Davis's The Woman King, most of the fighters were women. They were the Amazon fighters. So what this person does is to train these women fighters. And once he does that, he turns them against the king. Now, so this novel did receive different kinds of pushback or reviews. So let's look at one review that appeared in the Atlantic Journal. It describes the novel as Conrad's Heart of Darkness through a microscope. But John Thompson in the New York Times compared the Viceroy of Ouida to other prose works about Africa, and he notes, one could mention Graham Greene's Journey Without Maps, or for a work of the for a work for the imagination based on somewhat less horrendous events. Chinua Achebe's Arrow of God, that novel of West Africa has violence enough and cruel superstition too. Yes, it is suffused with the common humanity of which I find not one dried drop in the Viceroy. So what Thompson is actually saying here depicts the reality of what one experiences when one reads this novel. And I'll just read a paragraph from the novel just to sort of illustrate the way in which Chatwin presents the king and other people in the novel. And so here he's making reference to the king who he eventually helps to overthrow. He says, quote, often the king would dance himself, rolling his scapulars and weaving his steps around the skulls of his favorite victims. Or he would amuse himself by teaching little boys to chop heads, and when they made a mess of it, shout, not that way, you fool, think of chopping wood. So what we see in this novel then is a consistent portrayal of the African in such a way that it is just the element of violence, the element of superstition that emerges. Now, interestingly, 8 years later, Werner Herzog made a movie based on the Viceroy of Wheeler, and Klaus Kinski was the main character here. And I'm sure some of you know Klaus Kinski's work. But in any case, what we find in Cobra Verde is a doubling down of the violence and cruel superstition that Thompson refers to, that we see in the Viceroy. So I'm just going to play a few, segments of this movie, so we get a sense of what I'm referring to.
Die Frauen bei uns sind viel tapferer.
It's in German with Portuguese subtitles.
Mein Vater.
So this is the point where Cobra Verde begins to plot to overthrow the king, and this is the prince.
Professor Yao?
Yes.
I think you need to stop share and then share the another screen where the YouTube is.
Okay, so let me see. Stop share.
Yeah.
Okay, and then
Share screen again and then click the one where the YouTube appears on.
okay, share screen again. Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that's why we need to have technicians here, experienced people. So let's see.
Rechtmäßige Erbe des Throns. Gestern ist Bossa AHD mit der ganzen Armee nach Norden gezogen. Ja, dort leben viele Hügel. Wir werden König Bossa AHD besiegen. Dazu brauchen wir euch beide. Unsere Männer taugen zu nichts. Die Frauen bei uns sind viel tapferer. Mein Vater. Er muss sterben. Gehen jetzt zur Festung an der Küste. Und dort stellen wir einen Amazonenheer auf. Der Prinz will mit dir Blutsbrüderschaft schließen. Und Blutsbrüder dürfen sich nicht töten.
Wenn mir der neue König den Sklavenhandel übergibt, bin ich bereit. Begreift er überhaupt, was wir vorhaben?
Er ist einverstanden. Er hat keine Wahl. Er sagt zu allem ja. Er ist nämlich wahnsinnig.
So I'll skip to where he begins to train the Amazonas, the Amazon fighters. 1, 20. Oh, let me go back a little bit further.
Rückt auf eure Anfallposition. Ihr müsst dort viel mehr liegen. Dann werden wir siegen.
Ich still in die Erde gehen und wir werden fliegen. Lass mich schon reden.
Oh, better still, yeah. So this is the training. This is where he's training the Amazons to fight.
Wollen die nicht mehr? Was ist los? Los, los, aufstehen! Los auf die Beine! Wir wollen weitermachen! Aufstehen, na alle! Wird's bald! Hoch! Hoch mit euch! Ich schwöre, den Kopf vom Wasser rein! Nein, ihr seid noch nicht so. Ihr müsst noch mehr üben. Ihr wollt alles viel zu schnell. Ihr hört hier nur auf Reinkommen. Ich will nichts mehr hören. Wir werden den Palast in kurzer Zeit angreifen. Nur ich gebe die Befehle und ich bestimme den Schwerpunkt des Angriffs. Geht zurück auf eure Anfangsposition. Ihr müsst auch viel mehr üben. Dann werden wir siegen. Ich still in die Erde gehen.
Okay, so here now they are going towards the palace to attack the king.
Sie haben die heilige Bücher nach dem Teppich aus. Wir müssen umkehren. Alle zurück. An hier kommt kein Menschenleben vorbei.
So, in dem Land, auf dem ich komme, war ich selbst ein Schwanger. Mir Die toten Könige haben mich abgesetzt. Ich gehe jetzt fort. Ich will noch schlafen.
Mauert hinter mir die Türen zum Frauenhaus zu. Bleib zurück. Er lässt sich jetzt von seinen Frauen erwürgen.
Der neue König nimmt seinen Platz ein.
Ich hole ihn jetzt. Er hat dir den Namen Achinaku gegeben. Das bedeutet grüne Schlange. Er hat dich zum Vizekönig von Dahomey ernannt. Unser König Kangpe gibt dir das vor Elmina zur Residenz.
All right, now let me go back and can go back to the screen and yeah. So yeah, so what we see in this movie is again the representation of the cruelty that emerges in the novel as can everybody see the screen? Okay. So then the question then begins. So the next segment I want to is the Restless Crucible itself. But I think I am missing something here. Okay, fine. So this is then the Restless Crucible. So we are going back to the novel. For some of you who haven't had the chance to read the novel, I thought that it might be a good idea to sort of read the synopsis so that we see what the novel is all about. So the Restless Crucible narrates the story of Pedro de Barbosa, a Brazilian ex-slave, now turned slave merchant, who must go up against Queen Enasunu, the powerful Dahomeyan monarch resolved to end slave traffic in her kingdom. Set in the late 18th and 19th century, Salvador de Bahia, Brazil, and Dahomey on the West African coast, the novel describes Pedro de Barbosa's fight to become free in the Brazil of his time, as well as the events and actions that lead him to engage in the abominable yet lucrative slave trade. At the heart of this trajectory are the conditions that condemn an individual to poverty, discrimination, and humiliation because of skin color. The project to insulate himself from these injustices leads to a confrontation with the Dahomeyan queen Enasunu, whose personal story of forced marriage to the Dahomeyan king and the negation of her agency as a female in this tradition-bound society brings an uncomfortable identification with the enemy and the need to protect their society from both local and foreign predators. Queen Enasunu's misgivings are confirmed when her husband, along with the Portuguese governor and the king of Uida, disposes her father and sells him and his royal family into bondage. Queen Enasunu resolves to thwart the slave business in Dahomey and Uida, bringing up a long-delayed showdown with Pedro de Barbosa. So the question then I want to pose is, why did Pedro de Barbosa decide to become a slaver? And one of the most important things for him is the question of status. And if you look at this painting here, a family dining, is a painting by Jean-Baptiste Debré, a French painter who was in Brazil for some time. And what we find in this painting is the reflection of new identities based on the status of the masters. So the slaves that we see depicted here, especially the women, are wearing clothing and jewelry that reflect their master's status, you know. So for instance, the female on the far left side of the painting is depicted wearing a nice dress, necklaces, earrings, and headband, demonstrating the affluence of the female slaveholder. So in this situation, what we find is that the status of the slave is enhanced by the wealth of the slave owner. So within the framework of hierarchy, even within the slave, among the slaves, having a slave master that is wealthy and provides clothing and all that puts you in a different category. But for Pedro de Barbosa, this is not what he really wants. So I'll go to the novel and begin to explore the rationale behind Pedro de Barbosa's decision to become a slave trader. And this scene is 12-year-old Pedro de Barbosa making a statement based on an observation. He had spent most of his life in his master's fazenda, that is his latifundia or plantation, and then he brings him to Salvador de Bahia to become a servant for his children. And this scene takes place in one of the many parties that his master organizes for the very influential and affluent slave owners in Salvador de Bahia. And so he says, other conversations among Salvador's elite dealt with the production and exportation of sugar, cacao, and tobacco in Portugal. Over time, one thing became patently clear to me. These men who congregated here were rich, and with their wealth came power and influence. Put these forces together, and they control the destiny of their fellow men. As I reflected on the vow I had made not to become anyone's property, it suddenly occurred to me that the only way to accomplish that goal was to become a señor. And who, you ask me, is a señor? Based on what I had experienced in my short life, a señor was someone, especially Black or biracial, who had become wealthy and was conscious that his success in business and his accumulation of wealth and power would guarantee his freedom from the racist social determinism that condemns him to poverty, discrimination, abuse, and humiliation simply because of he was dark-skinned. I came to this realization because several biracial men were among the guests. One of them in particular intrigued me. He carried himself with purpose and poise, and the white folk that interacted with him treated him with the same decorum they have offered their own. I would find out later that he was Danilo Pereiro de Boto, the legitimate son of a Portuguese tailor and a biracial ex-slave. He owned slaves, and they had named him as acting president of the neighboring province of Sergipe. I had no clue at that time about how I was going to achieve my aim of becoming a señor. I reckoned, however, that the most important thing was not only to have identified my life's goal, but also that to achieve that purpose, I needed to deploy whatever means necessary, notwithstanding the consequences of my actions on others. You may call me a callous son of a bitch, but I'll tell you one thing. It's far better to be the one using the whip than the one receiving it. Trust me, I know. So here, the intentions of Pedro de Barbosa are very, very clear. He's looking for status. He is looking for wealth. He's looking to become wealthy. And one of the things that strikes one here is that we see a combination, or we see a transformation from biological Blackness to social Blackness. In other words, it doesn't really matter if you are Black, so long as you have the means, the resources, you are socially accepted within the framework of whatever goes on. And this is not really unique to the case of Brazil. In fact, even in the Dominican Republic, during, Santo Domingo, during that period, you had what they called blancos de tierra. So they are Black people who eventually emerge as important landowners, and by virtue of their status, become accepted as, if you wish, honorary white people. So wealth creation and freedom form part of this general idea for Pedro de Barbosa to become wealthy. So wealth creation, freedom against discrimination. So what happened with Pedro de Barbosa is that, you know, after experiencing several things, his the authorities in Brazil sort of recruit him and a few others to go to the British Parliament to indicate that Portugal was putting an end to slavery. And for some of you who may not know that in 1815, actually January 22nd, 1815, there was Portugal and Britain signed a pact. Now, remember that Britain had abolished slavery and they were doing all that they could to end slavery as we know it. So they signed this pact, and Portugal had promised that they were going to end the slave trade, and also that they were not going to trade, slaves below the equator. So in this novel, one of the things that the authorities did was to recruit a few quote-unquote freed slaves to testify in the British Parliament that indeed the treaty was being upheld and that slaves were being freed. So the portion I'm going to read for you here is the conversation between Pedro de Barbosa and one of the women who was included in the group to go to London. And in course of the transition, in course of the voyage, they fall in love and actually get married on the ship. So, of course, Pedro de Barbosa didn't tell her his main aim of going to London, that he wanted to escape and go to Dahomey to become a slave trader. He didn't want to disclose that to his wife because he felt uncomfortable and he knew that his wife might not agree. So this is the exchange between both of them. And again, at the end, we see one of the reasons why Pedro de Barbosa decides to become a slave trader. So, the both of them are now in Portugal because they left Salvador de Bahia, stopped over in Lisbon before they continued to London. So here he's talking to his wife about the idea that he wanted to go to Portugal, he wanted to go to Dahomey, and that he was thinking, he thought that she should come with him. But before that, he wanted her to stay in Lisbon for some time, and after he had made things all right in Dahomey, she could join him. So she says, "Did you ever inquire whether I wish to go to Dahomey?" Lucinda, and Lucinda is his wife's name. Lucinda asked as she sat up with her back against the bedpost and arms crossed over her chest. "Why did I have to ask?" I thought. "I'd mentioned it to you and everyone else on the ship." "Is that what you call asking? You consider telling an entire group of people your plans the same as asking me?" "Well," I started, but Lucinda interrupted. "Well, what? First, you said you wanted to move to Dahomey to set up a trading business. You didn't provide details. The next thing, you'll be the aide and bodyguard of a governor whom you just met on the ship. A merchant or a lackey? Which is it? And oh, I'm expected to stick around in Lisbon until you and your governor determine when I am to join you in Dahomey. Did I have a choice in this?" Lucinda asked, seethed. I was unprepared for Lucinda's outburst and questions. I'd thought that she would go along with my arrangement. Wasn't that what women did? No one had ever subjected me to this line of questioning as related to my intended ultimate objectives. I became flustered and understood that I had two options: stamp my authority and state that the decisions I had made were final and non-negotiable, and that as my wife and as a woman, Lucinda needed to agree and do whatever I determined was best for the two of us. My other alternative was to show my true intentions regarding Dahomey. Such a disclosure would lead to my discussing my subsequent dreams, of which she had now become an eminent part. I found both choices noxious and opted to straddle a fine line between the two. I provide half-truths, as I was wont to do under these kinds of circumstances. But I was about to learn that I had married a woman with an acute mind who could discover the most concealed intentions and fantasies blazed in one's brain. So the conversation continues, and then here, in frustration, Pedro de Barbosa says, "What do you want of me, Lucinda?" I raised my voice. "Do you want us to go back to Salvador? You want to remain Senor Batista's slave? Maybe that's what you desire. Perhaps, like Constancia said, servitude and bondage have become you." And then he says, "And me, what prospects does a freed slave have in Salvador?" "I don't know, Pedro, I don't know." And then he says, "What I hope for us, Lucinda, is a future in which we are not enslaved, a future where nobody can violate our children's bodies. I fancy walking the streets with my children without looking over my shoulder, a life in which I wouldn't look on the ground as I communicate with another man because my skin differs from his." So here we see some of the rationale behind his decision. So let me get to the end. Let me conclude by looking at the last part of the novel, sort of the denouement, if you wish. And here is the conversation between the Queen Enna Sunu, and the leader of the Amazon leaders, Amazon fighters called the Nominton. And it is the conversation in which we see the fight to stem the flow of slavery in Dahomey, and this is done within the framework of the female body, the females fighting. So let me just read as a short part, and then we can conclude. And so Cintina Fascino is the name of the leader of the women fighters, and Enna Sunu, Queen Enna Sunu, obviously, is the queen of Alada. So he says, "You remember the first time you summoned me into your living quarters?" Cintina Fasunu asked. "How could I forget? It was one of the most important days of my life. You, my love, came into my life and changed everything. Finding you was more important than the plans I had been devising," said Queen Enna Sunu. "I know. It took a little to recruit me to your cause, didn't it?" Cintina Fasunu asked. "Yes," said the queen. You are an extraordinarily brave woman. You know that, don't you?" the warrior whispered. "No, you are the brave and extraordinary one. You saved me, Sosa, and our cause," said Queen Enna Sunu. "Yes, but we still have a long way to go. Could you tell me again what you said the day we found each other? I should very much want to hear it before the sun sets for me," Cintina Fasunu said, breathing with difficulty. I told you they must never say that we, the women of Alada, Uida, and Dahomey, never raised our voices in objection to this abominable slave trade," Queen Enna began. "Yes, I remember. Please go on," says Cintina Fasunu. "That although some women have benefited from the largesse that has flowed to their powerful husbands who are engaged in the trade, there were others who have defied the trade because it was their sons, daughters, and husbands who were being hauled away. I said no one could hear the voices of these women as they cried and shed visceral tears. I bet because of you, one can now hear their cries, said the Nomiton leader. No, my love, it's because of you and your warriors who lost their lives today, said Queen Enna Sunu. I remember you said if you died doing your brief part to stop this madness, you'd go in peace. I feel the same way too, said Sintina Fasunu. Yes, I say that. Yet look at what cruel destiny and the wicked gods have carved up for us. It's you whom I'm losing, the queen declared, her soft wail still hovering over everything else. Sintina Fasunu's breathing slowed. A few moments later, she died. Queen Enna felt it as though her heart had just shattered. She lifted Sintina Fasunu's head into her bosom and whispered into her lover's ear. When they write the history of this trade, it will remember the lone voice of a brave and beautiful woman and those of many others who wailed in the darkness, in the fields, in the forests, on the oceans because they excised a part of them viciously and violently. That same history will tell of those voices that rebelled and cut deep into a system that seeks to extract from the other. Posterity will not be cruel to us, my love. It will be kind to us, the women whose wombs bore those who they carried away. So I'll stop here, and that's it.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Yao. That was amazing. I will now give over to Prof. Makoni for our initial discussion.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. That was amazing for a very well-structured presentation. I want to focus the discussion on more educational aspects of your work and more which have an administrative implications for me. Assuming hypothetically, you and me bumped into each other and we're sitting in African studies, then I said, you know what, yeah, your presentation was fine, etc., and all that. Can you come up with 2 or 3 courses that are best that we can design for African studies that are based on the work that you presented at the Global Forum? What would those courses look like?
Yeah, I think one of the courses would be the question of return migration.
Yes.
That for me is one thing that strikes me, that most of our students may not be aware that even though a lot of Africans were brought to the Americas, that some of them did actually return to their homelands. I mean, they may be aware of the freed slaves who left the United States and went to Liberia, because that is taught in some of the courses, but most of them are not aware of this. So I think that will be really very, very important. And then we can not only look at that migration, return migration, but also look at the various slave communities that I mentioned. So that can be one course. Another course is to concentrate on 3 of the ex-slave communities.
Yes.
So that can also be a course to sort of explore what it is that they brought from Brazil. The most interesting thing is that some of these ex-slaves brought their expertise. They were excellent tailors. They were engineers who knew how to agriculture. You know, they had learned that and brought that to West Africa. So exploring those 2 could be interesting courses to offer.
Let me take the number 2, the one about the different communities that were set up in West Africa. Is there a big enough body of scholarship that, let's say, if you wanted to put together an advanced 300, 400 level course, that there will be enough reading on that, comparing the different communities of where the returned slaves went back to.
Yes, yes. In fact, one of the things that one notices is that there's a lot of work that is done about return ex-slaves, but most of them returning to Europe.
Okay.
But not necessarily to Africa. But that is changing. In fact, a Ghanaian scholar published not long ago, his name is Kwame Essien, and he wrote this book called The Brazilian African Diaspora in Ghana. And his argument is that when we talk about the diaspora and we talk about the returnee communities, people concentrate only on the Aguda in Nigeria and Benin and not on Ghana. So this is an excellent piece that explores not only the Tabon in Ghana, but also goes into details to look at those in Nigeria and Benin. So there's an emerging scholarship now.
Okay. So that body of scholarship, let's say if you and me were just chatting and we then said, oh, okay, fine. Let's see if we can come up with another course that deals with African literature, but making use of the historical novel, using some of your work as a starting point. What will that course look like using historical fiction?
Okay, so
sorry to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to. These are genuine questions. Yeah, don't think that I'm making them. These are genuine questions of interest.
Yeah, I know you that as a friend. One thing's around and you stab him in the back. So no, yeah, I think these are good questions. So what happened? What I can think of is again to explore some of the questions of historical fiction and also combine that with movies. So I talked about the Woman Cave, Viola Davis. You know, what is representation? How is it done? So it could be a text, it could be a course that will look at both textual analysis and cinemas and articles. So off the top of my head, that is something.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Okay. Let me then shift to some more sort of conceptual. I want to, when I have time, you and me, it would be nice to meet and talk more about these various courses and see whether we can make them into reality. Right. Yeah. What I was really fascinated about was your discussions about race, where you were talking about biological blackness and social blackness, etc. Can you elaborate a bit more about how aspects about race, whiteness, or blackness played itself out amongst during this period that you were dealing with?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And specifically, if you look at Salvador de Bahia, was you know, a large population was Black.
Yeah.
So the idea of difference, the idea of race in its manifestation was a little bit different because of the large numbers that were there, right? So a lot of the slaves in Salvador de Bahia who had manumission were really, they did well. In fact, they would sell products, do things, and then pay their masters some of the, you know, whatever they made. So it was a way to gradually move out of poverty. And as one moves out, once the poverty, once conditions improved, education became possible, and one's status also sort of changed. But most importantly, the question of moving from one social group to another was paramount. And like I mentioned, it's not only in Brazil, in some of the Latin American countries. I mean, the Dominican Republic, and even in Peru, and even I think in Mexico, that it didn't really depend, and it didn't, your skin color didn't matter so long as you have the economic prowess. So,
Okay.
so that there is a sort of the elide the question of the skin color. So once you are able to move into some economic bracket,
Yeah.
then the color of your skin didn't really matter.
So once you're wealthy enough,
Yes.
the color of your skin was more or less
Secondary.
secondary. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Right. Let me hand over. Is Chanel, are you the one who is yes, okay.
Yes. Okay, so we already have a few questions. A lot of your colleagues, Professor Yao, is just congratulating you on this wonderful talk, but also saying in the same breath that they have to quickly go and prepare their lectures. So yeah, it's still morning that side. So just wanted to also just say that. But okay, so first question from Vanessa Austin. She's saying in the Viceroy of Ouida, it appears that the women warriors are working on behalf of the white man, even though it benefits their brother African. Is that accurate?
Well,
Yeah.
there are two things that are going on there. Cobra Verde is really very, very sneaky. So what it does is initially the king imprisoned him for some time and actually put him in this vat of completely filled with a violet color. So they wanted to transform him from a white man to a black man, eventually. So, but he's very skillful and is able to work his way to the good side of the king, and then convinces him that in order to be able to protect his kingdom and also engage in the slave trade, that it to be imperative to strengthen the military. I mean, the warriors were already strong, but what he offered was more tactical warfare. So yes, so he helped train these warriors with the idea that they will protect the kingdom. But then we know that he had the ulterior motive. So yes, so maybe on some level, he was training these women to use them for his own purposes. And of course, I think he does that. So there are two things here. On the one hand, trying to work with the king, and then on the other hand, fulfilling his own ulterior motives.
Vanessa Austin, you happy with that? You want to engage further?
Just so fascinated. I'm speechless, so thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, we then have Gary Weisel, who says, the politics of representation is interesting. I wonder if Bruce Chatwin was guilty of Orientalism. I'm pretty sure that Werner Herzog was. He had an obsession with the exotic and with violence.
Yes, I think I agree with Gary on that. Yeah, Orientalism, representation of the other, right? And its most debased form. And if you follow Klaus Kinski's works, most of the movies in which he appears are fraught with really violence and debasement. So yes, there is that element of representing the other in a way that fits with a certain predetermined agenda, if one wishes to put it that way. And I think that's where the definition of the historical fiction comes in, because the novelist has the ability to, or has the responsibility, or has the space to present a past experience, a past life, a past people in a way that brings sheds light to that particular group of people. The way one does it depends upon one's, I don't know, agenda. So in this case, yes, Bruce Chatwin wasn't in any way favorable to the Dahomey people, and hence his representation of people in Dahomey, and consequently, the movie Cobat Verde pushed that same agenda. Yeah.
Thank you. There's another question from Christine Severo. She says, thanks a lot for this presentation, Professor Yao. Regarding the discussion on reverse migration, how does this idea reframe the notions of origin and heritage? For example, what would be the symbolic place of Brazil in the imagination of those who returned to Africa? Also, what are some possible symbolic negotiations that emerge as a product of the reverse migration?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very interesting question. One of the things that is going on now is when we talk about the reverse migration, in the case of the Tabon, for instance, there is the wish, the desire of some of the descendants of these slaves to go back to Brazil. In fact, in 2005 or 2015, I think 2005, the then president of Brazil, Lula, went to Ghana to open a museum, on a visit. And there sort of an accord was, they wrote an accord where they sort of opened the space for Ghanaians from Tabon to go to Salvador, to go to Rio de Janeiro, in order to be able to, connect with that space. So in terms of the imagination, in terms of the imaginary, one can look at it from one perspective. Why did the ex-slaves move back to Africa? Most of them didn't know exactly where they came from. They knew they came from this region. So the imagination of going back home was a very paramount to them. So what about the other way, the other reverse migration? Do we see a lot of Africans wanting to migrate back to current day Brazil to not only reconnect with their roots or make a life there? Now, I'll tell you, most Ghanaians, if they had a chance, they'll go to Brazil, because of the conditions. But how do they get there? Maybe they can get there through Europe and the United States and Brazil. But of course, they get to Europe and come to the United States, they speak English, so there's no need for them to want to go to Brazil. So unless there is that kind of intense desire to explore, to reimagine the history of their ancestors, then that becomes quite interesting. And the project I'm actually working on now addresses that. So it's the story of a young woman who, a young girl who inherits a seashell from her mother. And this seashell had been passed from generation to generation. And the seashell has magical powers that allows one, given certain conditions, to go back to Brazil and really see the evolution of some of the members of that person's clan, family. So, so the idea of this story, this novel, is to revisit Brazil from that period and see the transition to Jamestown, and then back So somehow I am trying to deal with the idea of reverse migration and then another migration through imaginative means, so that the reader can see some of the migratory issues and the question of being in a different new environment and the tensions and all that. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but in a roundabout way, I've pitched my next project.
So we have Kitty Massett, who says that this was it was a wonderful presentation, and designing a course that focuses on historical fiction and pulls in related movies sounds appealing to students and to them. So she just thanks you for your work. We have no questions at the moment, but maybe I can just pop one in from myself. So I like the depiction of strong women in your work. For instance, I was very interested in Queen Enasunu, and also Lucinda as a quite very strong, outspoken woman. So I just wanted to know. I know that it is historical fiction as well. So is Queen Enasunu based on someone? And if not, what was the importance for you that women be the people that drive the abolition of slavery?
Yeah, I think Shannon, that's a very, very good question. If you look at some of the women, in fact, we've had, let me see whether I can think about this. There are a few queens in historically who fought against slavery. Even if we take the case of the Amazon fighters, they fought against the French, I think in 1810 or something like that, and defeated the French because they didn't want the French to come in and engage in slavery. But the irony of the fact of the fact of the matter is that they themselves, the women warriors, invaded other spaces and took their enemies into slavery and shipped them off. So with regard to Enasunu, I know that there was resistance within the Dahomey, group, but none of them had the wherewithal to rise up to this level. So again, I took that license to say, we never hear about these because there is obviously internal dissension against slavery. So I decided that I would, offer this avenue for a woman, a queen, to really talk about some of the atrocities and some of her own experiences, just so readers can get the sense that this actually happened and that there was resistance. And, I'm surrounded by women in my life. I have three very stridently outspoken women, and they wouldn't allow me to do anything less.
Thank you for that. I have a few comments that I will read out from Anissa. Thank you, for the most insightful glimpse into the minds of historical novelists, for sharing your creative genius and so much more. I wish you and the Restless Crucible huge success. And then Gary Weisel said, you might enjoy Julie Dash's film Daughters of the Dust, about Gullah women in the early 20th century. I hope I pronounced that correctly, as they migrate from the US South to the North. I don't know how historically accurate it is, but it certainly has an impressive ethics of representation. And Gary also has to drive to campus now.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. If there's anyone else who would like to pop a question, please feel free to do that. But for now, Prof. Makoni, do you want to perhaps? Oh, Nick Farrakas.
Nick wants to jump in, Nick.
Yes, this is excellent.
Yeah,
and I think it really points to a lot of ways that we can do our work more effectively. So you've chosen a genre that actually is a border crossing genre, because there's history there which has been assigned in the according to Western academics to one side of the one set of disciplines, and then literature, which is assigned to another set of disciplines. And that border crossing is very, very effective because, first of all, when you are writing literature, automatically, if you do it well, like you do it extremely well, you're inviting a dialogue. So in other words, there's a co-creation of meeting between what you're stating in that literary piece and then the person who's reading it. There's much more room for that co-creation of meaning. And I think that when we write according to how we've been taught in the social sciences, for example, you don't leave room for that. You provide all the answers, and the person who's reading just passively absorbs them or consumes them or is violated by them. So this is a good genre. And then I'm sure that your work will be more widely read than all of the other academic work that we do, that we do on from using the other approach. But that border crossing moves into so many different areas in your work because, again, it's movement across the Atlantic. There's a geographical border crossing. And again, very important because that border crossing that you're talking about is in a direction that's different from the one that's usually talked about. So that's extremely important. Getting upsetting and upending all of this monodirectional orientation that we've been given from the kind of history that we've been taught, and also monocausality, all of that. Yeah. So that I think is really, really important. But then again, you're talking about border crossing and trans performances that are not just geographical or disciplinary between literature and social sciences, but also class. Yes. So in other words, how that gets negotiated. Somebody who is born or spends their youth as somebody else's property, and then in the end tries to reverse that equation and to become somebody who has property. There's that there too. Then, of course, the whole ethnic thing. So again, how do you become a person who is raised as minus white? How do you become an honorary how do you begin an honorary plus white classification out of that? And then of course, the gender element and how you are assigned gender and sexuality. So that interaction between between that couple. Okay, so Pedro and his wife was a really interesting one too. So, and then of course the interaction between the queen and the warrior, the head of the warriors, that as well brought that in. So there's all kinds of border crossing, and that's why, again, something that will make this the kind of work that will catch people's imagination and then get people to start making the dialogue that people get into with this work, a dialogue that will actually unsettle a lot of received a lot of things that are taken for granted. But talking about things that are taken for granted, when we're talking about history and historical novels and etc., and especially African history, there's a tendency to as in all histories that are constructed around the Western approach or the colonial approach, is to focus on what's happening with the upper classes. And so these royal courts who have, I mean, at the time period you're looking at, these royal courts who have experience or who are the product of 400 years of contact with this ruinous system that put all of these terrible things into place, enslavement, etc., etc. So that somebody like Pedro sees his only option as to do this trans performance, but a trans performance that's actually not about sovereignty, it's about an illusion of power. Okay, so there's that. But then talking about sovereignty, what about doing another border crossing so that what's going on at this time in the villages, in the smaller communities, okay, where some that may not have experienced as deeply this ruination as the royal courts have. And then we can get into these really, really interesting echoes that when you talked about the seashell, it really was wonderful, because if you look at especially the Portuguese and the western coast of Africa, the Atlantic coast of Africa, there's so many things that could be tied in here. For example, the whole renegade tradition. So in other words, because sailors on ships, first of all, were from probably the most marginalized classes in Portugal.
Yeah.
Okay, Romani, people who were put into jail and then as part of the sentence were put on the ships. People who were forced out by the Inquisition because they had ancestors who were Jewish or who were Muslim, etc., etc. So as soon as a lot of these people got to West Africa, they jumped ship. They jumped ship, the Lanzados and the Tangumais and all of those. Okay, they jump ship and they get integrated into West African communities, and that interaction is so interesting. And it would and maybe there it would be so different in terms of what kind of trans performances are possible, because many of these Portuguese renegades actually married African women, had children, and became totally integrated into the communities. And in that process, you see emerging things like all of the trade networks, the major cities in West Africa. A lot of that comes from that interaction, and it's more of an interaction that's not asymmetric, but actually has a dialogue in terms of, it has a real exchange going on. So that's one interesting thing that could be part of your course. Of course, when you're talking about reverse migration and these and these trans phenomena. But then another one would be going a little further south to Sao Tome, Sao Tome and Principe and Annobon, because there, in the late 1500s, you get the first successful defeat of a plantation regime, permanent defeat. So in other words, in Annobon, the Portuguese were thrown out and all the plantation owners were thrown out, and nobody from Europe was allowed on the island, not even priests, for another 200 years. And that's in the late 1500s. Okay, so we're talking, and then in Sao Tome and Principe, a similar thing happened, so that the Portuguese had to remove their headquarters from Principe, and Principe, as this is the late 1500s, had become before that revolt, before that successful revolt, had become the world center for sugar production, and it collapsed. So that would be not less of a renegade phenomenon, but more a maroon phenomenon, and to tie that into this rich history that's coming 3 centuries later. So and to show how all of that is reverberating, and how those traditions of resistance that come from Sao Tome and Annobon and Principe actually informed a lot of what eventually made enslavement impossible in the Americas. So all of those interesting reverberations, all of those trans phenomena going back and forth across the Atlantic, traditions of resistance, traditions of renegadism, of marronage, all of that would be wonderful things to put in a course like this. And but I think that really I want to just commend you for taking this approach. I'm just wondering though, do you think that it would, or how possible would it be to kind of weave in some of these other strands that don't focus on the ruling classes, that don't focus on the empires, that don't focus on the courts, the royal courts, in West Africa, but to actually give us a better insight into what was happening, maybe at the same time or even earlier, at the level of like communities that weren't positioned in the ways that those royal courts were.
Well, Nick, thanks for your observations. I mean, as usual, you have a brilliant way to, sum things up and see all these connections. Thanks for that. I think one of the it makes sense to look at communities that are not necessarily royal based, but the fact of the matter is that if you look at most African countries, I mean, I can talk about Ghana, the village structure is such that you may have a chief, you may have the elders, you may have the clan. So it's also structured in such a way that more of an interaction, let's say that, more of an interaction between the common people, if we can use that word, with the rulers. I mean the clan leaders, the chiefs. So there is more of an interaction and interface between these groups, as opposed to the European court system, where you have this well delineated classes where you cannot really interact with those in power, those who control discourse and all of that. So yes, I think it would be interesting to explore that, but my gut feeling is that what will eventually emerge will be sort of a more of a cohabitation, a more of relationship that take into consideration not only the living but also the dead, the ancestors and the role they play, and all of that, I think, would eventually provide a rich milieu that is definitely different from your European traditional, ruling class and system. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and then maybe another angle from which to approach this would be looking at sovereignty. So in other words, the sovereignty that comes with the relationship that people in communities have with land, and and also that community itself as a base for sovereignty, et cetera, as opposed to what happens in a royal a situation where those structures, such as royal houses, are inserted, where sovereignty again is something that those kings and queens, etc., have a monopoly on. So people's sovereignty has been usurped in many ways. Whereas what you find, even in situations where there may be chiefs, etc., that sovereignty with land, with language, with epistemic sovereignty, people's belief in their own abilities to actually confront the problems that they face in life and solve those problems without depending on an expert class to do so. Those kinds of things, which I think there are still remnants of even today in many communities in West Africa.
Right.
Thanks, Nick. I will quickly read out a comment from Christine, and then I will ask Desmond to ask his question. Christine says, Prof, yeah, your proposal reminds me of a novel, Desmedida, written by the Angolan writer Rui Duarte de Carvalho, about the historical connections and comings and goings concerning the relation between three places, Luanda, Sao Paulo, and the San Francisco River, located in the northeast of Brazil. Such historical comings and goings also reframe the notion of time and space. So the river was a big metaphor in this particular novel, if you would like to follow up on that. I don't know if you wanted to make a quick comment on that, or if you are familiar with the novel.
I'm not familiar with the novel, so I think I'll make note of that because I'll be interested in reading that too, just to inform myself a little bit more about what people are thinking in terms of space, in terms of connections and all that. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Desmond, feel free to ask your question.
Thank you so much for this very insightful presentation. I want to join everybody else to congratulate you and applaud you for choosing this path that sort of exposes things that most people may not often think and talk about. That is to sort of dig your fingers into the complexities of transatlantic slavery beyond broad stroke narratives that I think organize public memories. My specific, actually, before I make my comment, I just wanted to go back to the distinction we're making between biological and social blackness, and one could say also biological or social whiteness, that it just made so much sense because many people who engage with race today as a permanent marker, at the same time we acknowledge that these are social constructions, don't often think about the genealogy of that construction. But I think if we think of the time when this is going on, it would make sense that race was a supremely fluid construct,
Yes.
one that bent around the arc of social class. I think
Yes.
some people have pointed to this. So I think maybe people will be more fervently attached to racial categories as fixed today as they might have been then, simply because the people then were part of the earliest, part of the generation that was sort of establishing the notion of race as a way to categorize human beings. We have inherited the product of that effort, but not the complexity of the narratives, the genealogy of those narratives, which I think is really the usefulness of the work you're doing here to help demonstrate to people what that process might have looked like. The area I had a question was exactly what Nick was just talking about. You know, getting beyond narratives about what is often called the elite, you know, the famous, the warlords and so forth. This is my critique of Henry Louis Gates' work on Africa's Great Civilization, that you end up hearing replicas of European monarchs and military men and so forth on the African continent. And what disappears is what was often called, you know, the history of the voiceless, the people who sort of can't speak for themselves, so to speak. Now, to add to what Nick is saying, and I don't know if this is a question or a suggestion, or maybe to frame this as a question would be to ask, where do you draw much of your evidence? Right, where do you sort of get ideas and inspirations about these historical processes? If these are purely, are only or mostly written narratives, I think it might raise questions about who was writing that, from what perspective. In the work I do, one part of the work I do recently on the history of education in Africa, what has been fascinating to me is that Western historians of education remain so obsessed with colonial education. Colonial education in Africa. As a matter of fact, if you look at the publications on that subject, about 99% of the publications focus on the educational processes that were happening while Europeans were running institutions on the continent, whether it's missionaries or colonialists. Not much has been done about what has happened since the so-called independence era, for instance, or what might have been happening prior to, or even what other educational activities were going on while Europeans were there trying to set up a Western-style formal schooling. Now, when I ask that question, what it leads me to is a recognition that the historians who do this work focus almost exclusively on European archives, archives created by colonialists or missionaries housed in museums and various places throughout Europe and North America. So the question I've asked myself, which is sort of the direction I'm moving, is if we were to set archives aside for a moment, what else can we find? You know, some of the narratives we're talking about about events that happened in the 20th century, early 20th century. And a lot of some of the people involved in those narratives are still alive. I don't think that we have a habit of engaging with them in conversations about their own experiences in encountering Europeans. So if we were to get outside of royal courts or chieftains and so forth, and say, can we engage with the ordinary people? What might we find? And I think to put this final fine point on this, the brief exploration of this subject, at least on the history of education that I've mentioned, suggests to me that even some of the people we consider chiefs on the African context were products of that colonial expansion, right? So if I were to go to an African context and say, hey, this chief said this is how they run things, and I don't explore how this person became the chief, I might be reproducing a European and Eurocentric narrative. So it's really a very difficult job, I think, because essentially you're going to have to develop a completely new set of tools, new set of epistemic tools that will lead you to not only different set of evidence, but also different questions. And I wonder if this is even doable for the kind of work you do. But otherwise, again, thank you so much for this. I think you opened my eyes on something that connects multiple dots. And I think this is a new exploration for me. So thank you so much.
Yes, Desmond, good question and good observations, especially with regard to race and social class, and the fact that the question of race, as we understand it now, was a little bit different from say 18th century, 19th century Brazil. And I think you are also right on the point that it is really very difficult to engage even the chiefs, because the educational system, I mean, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in every part of Africa that you go, has been entrenched within the colonial framework, so that to completely break away and say you are having an autochthonous educational system that is based on the values, based on the traditions of a particular community, is very, very challenging. First of all, who is going to engage in that? What questions are they going to ask? From what perspective? What kind of educational experiences have they had? And so it's really, really very, very difficult to come up with an epistemological framework to say, well, we are looking at this particular history, we are looking at this particular community to the extent that we don't have any overarching influence from the colonial past or even the present that has been informed by the colonial past. So Desmond, I'm not sure how to answer this question. I'm not sure, because sometimes I go to my village, and my grandmother lived till she was about 101 and was as lucid as perhaps even much more lucid than I was. I was in my 50s when I would go to her and she would look at me and say, my husband, yeah, the last time you came, you said you were going to bring me this. And she remembers. Okay, so even that old woman who didn't have much of an education, she was married to my grandfather, who was trained by the missionary. All right. So the stories that she would tell me were stories that one would say were traditionally based. Yes, they were traditionally based, but they were unconsciously informed by the experiences her husband had with interacting with the German missionary, because the part of the Volta region that I come from, it used to belong to the German. It was a German colony, and then after the Second World War, it became a protectorate of the British. So Volta Togoland, that's what it used to be. And so my grandfather, had German education. So It's really, really difficult. I don't know whether the situation will be different in Nigeria or in Puerto Rico or anywhere else where the long reaches of the colonial experience is not evident, you know. Yeah.
You know, if I might just say one more thing quickly, I don't know that this will be helpful, but I completely agree with the difficulty you're raising here, because it's not an easy thing to approach. But when I was saying that this will require for us to approach with a new set of epistemic lens, let me share with you some of the ways that I'm beginning to do that, and to engage with what you just pointed out, that the people you are likely to encounter wear at least two sides of that colonial imprint on their bodies and minds. One of which is most of them that I know have become Christianized. They have adopted a narrative of Europeans as these people who came to do Africa good, and people who actually managed to do a lot of good, set up good schools, set up missions, brought us civilization, and then we quickly kicked them out, and then a bunch of hooligans in the name of politicians have taken over the system and they're running things down. It's almost like there's a nostalgia there for the good old days of the white men running things. The other thing I see from them is that many of them who worked directly with either missionaries or colonialists carry that experience, carry that attachment or proximity to Europeans as a badge of honor. So you hear people in public conversations say, oh, I work with Father Barrett, or I work with so and so. Almost like having been connected to this European is something they would be proud of, something people should respect. Now, here's what I did. And one of the people through which I'm engaging with this is my own father. My father lived and worked for decades with an Irish missionary priest who was the first European to come to my ancestral homeland, set up missions, set up schools, and so forth. As a matter of fact, the name I bear today, Desmond, is after this Irish priest, Father Desmond McGlade. My father is still alive and sharp, probably like your grandmother today. So when I was in Nigeria this last year, one of the things I did was to sit down with him and ask him to tell me stories about his childhood. I didn't make any reference to missionaries. I didn't make any reference to schools. I said, what was your childhood like? Then I was asking, what was the neighborhood like? What was the village like? What were the family relationships and so forth? And it was amazing to me that at no point in that conversation did he make reference to his encounters with missionaries. I even probed him about the stories his own father told him about his father's childhood. I was approaching that conversation not to validate what I already suspected about colonial conquest, about the ways that Europeans encountered that part of the world. I was approaching it with an honest intent to understand what that community was like before Europeans arrived. And it happened that this is the northern part of Igbo land, among the places Europeans encountered at last. It was at the point where Europeans clashed with Islam coming from the north. So if you were to, at least for me, I'm hoping that by asking a different question, a more open-ended question that is not anchored on European experience, that focuses more on what they might have known about the community. And even when they sort of, begin to draw on European experiences, I would want to imagine that that's fine, right? When we engage with these colonial archives, they are always in conversation with the African context in this case, right? Or the non-European context, more broadly speaking, but being processed from the European perspective. I would want to see how my father was then, and maybe over time, processing his encounter with Europeans. How was his father engaging with it? I'll give you a specific example of the way I'm thinking about this. He has told me a while ago that his own father did not want him to work with missionaries. He had wanted one of his brothers to do that. And his reason was that my dad seemed to be the more dexterous type, more calm and collected, and he had a more playful brother. And his father and the community had seen engaging with Europeans as the act of a useless person. So they thought the playful one would be more, would align more with this foolish thing that Europeans were doing. I think that there already begins to give me some sense of the idea of resistance, or the way that, they perceive Europeans at those early stages, right? So that it helps me to reread any European who says Africans were demanding European engagement, they were demanding European education or European language and so forth. And there are people who make that argument. I don't know how helpful this would be for the work you do, but at least sharing that as part of the lens with which I engage with that. I'm hoping somewhere.
Yeah, Desmond, I like the way you say it depends upon the kind of questions we ask, reframing the question. That doesn't come with any ulterior, having an open-ended question, asking the right questions. And I'm glad that you've been able to do that. And for me, this also opens a space for me as I move forward I'll be going to Ghana in the summer, in the fall. And I'm going to go to Gabon. I'm going to go to Jamestown. And I know there are lots of people who go there and do interview some of the descendants of these ex-slaves. But what I'm learning now, I think, is going to inform me with regard to the kinds of questions that I should be asking, not only for these returnees, but also, of course, looking at my own village that unfortunately is losing its language because anyway, that's another story.
That's another story for another day.
Yeah.
I think what is interesting to me about this is that it gets us back to discussions about archives. My current position, unsophisticated position at the moment, is as follows. I'm not so much worried about the institutional archive and the problems that they have and the gaps that are there. I tend to think of what I call family individual archive, in the sense that most families that you meet or encounter, or at least my own Makoni family, clan, etc. I've been able to get a lot of material, written material, whether these are school reports for some of the individuals that went to these, the letters that were being written by so and so, sent to another place, a Bible in which there were comments written on the margins, etc. So in other words, what I'm sort of saying is, once I've shifted my lens from an institutional archive to a family archive, and I say to all Makoni clans and all that, do you have any letters written by so, do you have any photographs about so and so? And they begin to provide that material. You're able to construct, at least for me, I'm able to begin to construct a very rich narrative about who these individuals were. Because there is a lot of writing that took place within those families. But we tend to overlook that particular amount because we don't look for it. But if you ask somebody, they will give you some letter that was written to them by some uncle, or a list of items that they needed to be bought from some white shop owner somewhere else like that. And once you've got all that material, I've got it in a bag, but as usual, I've never found time to it. I'll have to write. That will be the only useful book that I'll write in my entire life for the Maconis. Because they now are insisting, what is the point of writing for everybody, but not for us? So, but what I found is that there is a lot of that material. It comes in fragments. You have to sort of ask each individual. But once you know you are interested in it, once they think it is scholarly important, they
Yeah.
will give you a lot of material, written material that is scattered, floating around within some of these families. Yeah.
Yeah.
That may not be useful for historical fiction, but
You never know.
you never know. You never know.
You never know.
Sanil, you're the one who's, yeah.
No worries. Toyin Falola also speaks about, I think he's called it alternative archives. So that's also a useful source for us perhaps to explore. Okay, great. I think this is a good stopping point for us to end the forum here. Professor Ya, thank you so much. This has
Thank
been
you
a
very much,
really,
Shao.
really
Thanks
great
a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Before
Yeah.
you go, Gabriel, since you are in Bahia, how